Ladies and gentlemen, my first guest tonight is a diplomat and an author who became the first woman to serve as National Security Advisor and the first African-American woman to serve as Secretary of State. Please welcome Secretary Condoleezza Rice. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
I'm so glad.
I have to say something to start.
Yes, ma'am.
That was great walk-up music. Thank you to the band. They're fantastic. Thank you.
Now, I was saying to you backstage, I can't believe I've never interviewed you
know.
before. I thought I had, but I was assured by my staff that I haven't.
Right.
I've got so many questions I want to ask you from the last 18 years, but I'll boil it down to the last 3 days.
All right.
Okay?
Okay. All right.
Trump invited the Taliban to Camp David.
Right.
3 days before 9/11.
Right.
Where did you find your jaw once you realized it had dropped?
Well, let me make a point first about the decision to cancel the meeting. That was a good decision. Because
often his best decisions are not to do the things he decided.
Well, whatever the reason, it was a good decision because I think the Taliban has become convinced that we want a deal far more than they do. You know, over the last years, not just the Trump administration, but going back to the Obama administration, we've been talking about the importance of leaving. We need to bring the troops home. We all want this war to end. But I think the Taliban had become convinced that they could get just about any deal, and it's good that the meeting was canceled. Now, yes, I would probably not have chosen to do the meeting at Camp David 3 days before 9/11.
Seemed insensitive, but tone deaf
well,
at the very
let's just
best.
say I might have found another venue.
Okay. What do you think? What do you make of the idea of being in these peace negotiations with the Taliban? Are they partners you can negotiate with? I mean, obviously they're the bad guys here.
But
are. As people say, in peace negotiations, you're dealing with an enemy. Can they be trusted?
Right,
you said once that the Taliban is not interested in a stable Afghanistan.
I think that is still true. But the fact is, you rarely are negotiating with your friends. You're usually negotiating with your adversaries. And I know Zal Khalilzad, the negotiator. He worked for me several times. He's a very sound and competent person. And if he gets the backing to not take a bad deal, this negotiation is the right thing to do. Because all wars have to end.
If he gets the backing to not take a bad deal, what's that mean?
If he gets the backing from the president and from the White House, I know he will get the backing. Secretary Pompeo, Secretary of State, has said that we have to go back to principle first. We're not going to negotiate an end to the Afghan war that is going to leave the Taliban with the ability to just bring terrorists back in the way that they did before 9/11. We're not going to abandon the Afghan government, which over 18 years has built into something of a democratic government, even though weak. And I hope we're not going to abandon the women of Afghanistan. You know, when I'm going to tell you something. I visited Afghanistan, I think, 8 or 9 times as Secretary of State. And the most remarkable thing was to see women in the police force, women in the armed forces, girls going to school. Do you realize that when the Taliban was in control, girls couldn't go to school? So we cannot abandon these women.
How do you trust these people to actually come to the bargaining table?
I wouldn't trust them. Ronald Reagan had a phrase, trust but verify.
Sure.
And so you can negotiate an agreement, but we need to leave forces there long enough to make sure that the Afghan army is able to defend itself. We've been keeping the peace in Korea for now 50 plus years, 60 years. And it's worked well to keep the peace. And so I understand the American people's, that we're tired of keeping the peace in various places. I understand that these wars have gone on a very long time. But we're just about to have the anniversary, the 18th anniversary of September 11th. Let's not forget what happened in Afghanistan at the time, the 5th poorest country in the world. Let's not forget that that's where al-Qaeda plotted and planned to take down the Twin Towers, to blow a hole in the Pentagon, to cause the deaths of those people on Flight 93. Let's not forget that and get too anxious about getting this war settled. We will get it settled. We can make a deal, but let's make a good deal, not a bad one.
That's a reasonable That's a perfectly reasonable position to make. How did you imagine at the time? Was there some discussion among the team with the Bush administration in 2001 and 2002 during the initial invasion of Afghanistan? How did you imagine it was going to end? What do you think was going to be the ending of this? Because 18 years later, it still looks like not entirely sure what the withdrawal looks like.
Well, we knew it would be hard. As I said, this was the 5th poorest country in the world. I remember...
Famously a swallower of
I remember very well going to Camp David on that Friday after 9/11, and that Saturday morning we were planning the invasion of Afghanistan, because we knew we were going to have to do that.
Did anyone at that point said, you know, we should have the Taliban over here someday?
No. But, you know, we rolled out a map, and I remember thinking, I'm an old Soviet specialist, and I remember thinking, oh, my goodness, Afghanistan, isn't that where great powers go to die? The British, the Soviets. And so we were worried about how long it would take, but we knew we had to do 3 things. We had to defeat Al-Qaeda. And we've gone a long way toward, if not defeating Al-Qaeda, disabling Al-Qaeda to do the kind of attack that they did on 9/11. I don't think that that organization could do what it did on 9/11. We've gone a long way toward helping to create a decent place for the Afghan people to live, and they have become our allies and friends. But the work isn't done yet, and that's a hard truth, that's a hard reality. But sometimes these things take time. As you know, I'm on book tour about a book about German unification. Thank you. I was hoping you would do that. Yes, thank you very much.
It's called To Build a Better World.
Right. And this is the story. This book was first issued as a book in 1994 called Germany Unified and Europe Transformed. And Philip Zelikow, my co-author, and I had been young staffers on the George H.W. Bush administration when Germany was unified. Believe it or not, Germany has now been unified this coming year 30 years. But Germany was divided from 1945 until 1990. It took that 45 years to bring a stable and enduring peace in Europe. And so sometimes these things take time, and I hope we have the kind of patience and the kind of foresight that the people who ended the Cold War on terms favorable to us, I hope we can do the same this time around.
Well, what do you think of the terms that are developing right now? Because this is to build a better world, again, at the end of the Cold War. Now we're back into another kind of, I don't know if it's a Cold War, but certainly into a conflict with the former Soviet Union, with Russia and Putin. Right. You have the Brexit, basically the post-war alliance is breaking up, or certainly being weakened with the help from the Russians.
There's no doubt about that.
How much le poop are we in Europe right now?
It's not a good story in Europe right now. As I said in this book, we talk a little bit about what has happened to a number of the vectors, as we call them, a number of the elements that we thought, well, we're academics, please forgive us. Sure. But a number of the elements that we were concerned about. Now, if you take Germany itself, in many ways, Germany unified successfully. But the alternative for Germany, which is the right-wing populist German party, it is strongest in the East, which suggests that somehow the East still feels humiliated by what happened. If you take the Russians, of course, where I think administrations from George H.W. Bush to President Clinton to President Bush II to President Obama tried to bring Russia into the international system. Nobody tried to humiliate Russia. But Vladimir Putin tells a story that it was always our goal to humiliate and encircle Russia. I know him very well. I spent a lot of time with Vladimir Putin.
Good guy?
No. Look, he liked me at one point because I'm a Russianist.
Okay.
And one day we were having a discussion, and he said, you know, Condi, you know us. Russia's only been great when it's been ruled by great men like Peter the Great and Alexander II. Now, of course, every bone in your body wants to say, and do you mean Vladimir the Great? But of course, you can't say that. You're Secretary of State. That would be rude.
Sure.
But that's who he thinks he is. He thinks he's reuniting the Russian people in greatness. Too bad if you have to eat Ukrainian territory or prop up a dictator like Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Too bad if you have to engage in Venezuela. What are the Russians doing in Venezuela, of all places? So he has decided that he needs an enemy, and it is us.
Do you agree with the president that Putin should be allowed back into the G7 to make it a G8?
No, I don't. But I don't.
What do you make of him advocating for that?
I don't think they ever should have been in the G7. It was supposed to be the world's largest economies. And when's the last time you bought anything made in Moscow that wasn't made of petroleum? And don't say vodka, you would have bought that from France these days.
I was over there 2 years ago, and I bought a lovely box for my wife, which I'm sure has a microphone in it. The book is To Build a Better World. It's available tomorrow. Secretary Rice, everybody. We'll be right back with Bill Skarsgård.